Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Tyler, the Creator, called Igor. You know, at this point, what can you even expect from Tyler, the Creator anymore? And I say this as someone who could admit to being more tolerant of the guy at his most foul and abrasive and controversial, but also someone who never quite celebrated him at his various peaks either, at least not in comparison to some of the die-hard fans. Now, don't get me wrong, at his most shocking, I've always been convinced there was more damaged pathology than even he would probably admit, but as much as I really dug Flower Boy back in 2017, damn near the polar opposite of those early albums like Goblin and Bastard, it wasn't a project that stuck with me longer as much as others, or as much as I wanted it to, or one from this era that I quite found as revolutionary as most in its content, which at points could feel a little underwritten. Hell, what I found most striking was a lot of the production, which had its off-kilter edge and the very clear influence of Pharrell and the Neptunes, but also attracted a peculiar, homespun brand of beauty that Tyler could make his own. So when I heard that more than ever this project Igor dropped with little warning or promotion, it was even further away from conventional hip-hop in its delivery, and reportedly picked up even more some of the production elements from the messy, much maligned, but fascinating 2015 album Cherry Bomb, for this being a bittersweet breakup record. Well, it was sure to be unique, so alright, how is Igor? Oh boy, I'm not gonna make any fans of this one. And what's surprising is that if there's a case in 2019 where I'm trying so damn hard to like an album and just feel like I'm coming up short, it's with Igor. I certainly hear the appeal. From a more layered and melodic standpoint, it's probably Tyler, the Creator's most cohesive but boundary-pushing project to date in terms of his sound. And yeah, I'm adding that qualification because in 2019, it's hard to avoid the places where the niche for this particular sound is just a little bit more crowded, and thus I'm not quite as gripped or surprised by this as I would like to be. It also happens to be one of those albums where for every choice in the artistry that doesn't click for me, the fans is going to highlight, well, that's the point. Which, you know what's all fine and dandy. I've used that argument before myself to justify my own fondness for certain projects where the art hits that tonal resonance specifically for me, so I can only hope that just being kind of lukewarm on this is given the same emotional consideration by you guys. Right? Because really a huge part of this does start with Tyler, the Creator himself. His choice to rap less than ever on this album and embrace more of the thinner, slightly distorted and off-key singing that began to crop up on Flower Boy and is all the more prevalent here. And while even he would probably admit that he's not a good singer, the argument that the weak vocals do reflect something that's homespun and pure and raw in their delivery, a very punk approach where the juxtaposition of his loneliness and feelings of being out of place and weird, they're all the more pronounced against production that feels alternatively futuristic and overflowing with the buzzy synths, or dipping its toes towards soul and jazz, the lush cascading keys, and an intricacy in the composition that'll probably never get the full credit it deserves. So yeah, I get the juxtaposition there, but why is it not clicking for me where it does kind of work coming from an act like, say, Brockhampton? And make no mistake, with the increased pitch shifting and vocal filters, you really can't avoid the comparison this time around. It's always been there, but now it's blatant. Well, you know what, if you've seen my Brockhampton reviews, the messy truth of that is that it only kind of worked haphazardly with that boy band across all the Saturation projects, only bringing together enough refinement on iridescence to lend its fragility, the swell, to actually hold together. It had the impression of desperately swinging for the fences and going big because, well, that was the only way the collective was going to survive, individually or together. The emotional dynamic across Igor, by necessity, it's more intimate, so maybe that rawness would translate to a smaller picture, and yet that doesn't quite happen? Now, granted, part of the reason why is that, like with Flower Boy, there are layers of vocal deflection and contortion that do kind of detract from some of that sense of intimacy and rawness, and that doesn't count the uncredited guest stars, which even got some fans questioning whether or not Tyler was simply playing the majority of all the parts just by pitch shifting his voice. Hell, maybe it would have been better if he had done more of it. Yeah, Solange, she sounded great whenever she was behind to fill in the ad-libs, and I'm not really going to complain about about some great vocal soul samples, or when Charlie Wilson showed up for some baritone support on EARFQUAKE, but how on earth they thought stripping out some of that same baritone soul away from CeeLo Green was a good idea, I have no idea. And while there are still far too many acts that find the sentient music meme Playboy Cardi interesting, there's enough of an explanation why he's here on EARFQUAKE, even though I think he adds nothing. I will absolutely question why Tyler got Lil Uzi Vert of all people to fail to croon through the opener and add even less, or why he recruited Kanye West to yelp through a non-verse on Puppet. I mean, at least Santa Gold's filtered vocals, they kind of make sense on New Magic Wand, and given the Frank Ocean influence on the atmosphere of the whole project, I can kind of see why traces of him crept across Running Out of Time. But beyond texture, I'm not sure what these vocal guests add to the larger picture, and that's a question I do have for this approach to a breakup album. If you're going to continue to deflect from vulnerability with layers of vocal obfuscation for yourself and your guest, where we only get non-distorted snapshots of Tyler by himself infrequently, if you're not enraptured by the production or the vibe or the content, you're going to find some of that impact muted just by so many cooks in the kitchen. There's that level of artificiality that might push you aside. And when you go to the production, look, I know the juxtaposition is part of the point, but the increasingly refined and intricate piano work just doesn't quite capture the organic warmth of the guitars that captured the greatest moments of vulnerability across Flower Boy, and the reliance on blocky synth work doesn't always help either. Now, part of this, unfortunately, calls back to mixing and mastering issues that made their most stark return since Cherry Bomb, where the vocals can be buried midway to the back, the bassy synth leads are dominant off the grittier drums, not the first time the fidgety, squeaking progression showed the expected Neptune's influence, because of course it does, and the guitar work is either tinny if it's acoustic, or scuzzed out chunks if it's electric, the latter even being played by Jack White on the closing song, and you know what? It does lead to one of the most triumphant moments on the album, even if it does land on a weirdly abortive note. It works much better coming off the right lines on A Boy's a Gun. But I think my biggest issue comes in how the mixes never quite feel as rich as they really should, because of an overweight low end that is rarely balanced by fuller melodic textures in the mid-range outside of maybe vocals, and sometimes not even those. I mean, you'll get percussion in the mid-range that has texture but not a lot of melodic tone, and at least the upper end getting really blaring and tinny to fill it in. And the frustrating thing is that while the pitch-shifted vocals rarely click as well as they should for me, I do like the piano lines. There's a lot of complexity there, and the majority of the synth work, and there's a lot of vocal harmonies that could sound a lot more rich, but like with Cherry Bomb, there's this weird feeling that Tyler's trying to force a brand of abrasion and flair that more natural instrumental timbres might pay off more effectively or not feel so sickly in the mix. A lot of blunt flair and attention to the subtleties and the fine details of the melodies, but less the overall feel and tone of the song. Again, not saying that there aren't moments that I like, because there are, but it might be a case where Tyler's hewing a little bit too close to his synthetic influences and providing maybe even too much restraint, too much artificiality. And you know what? That might be something to the content as well. As I mentioned before, this is a breakup album, but the album seems strangely closed off to the emotive details that might drive it, let alone the partner in this case. Now, credit where it's due, Tyler the Creator doesn't shy away from framing the emotional walls and the reliance on desperate swings of affection as kind of unhealthy, because they are. All it's fueled by overcompensating immaturity and insecurity that's been rife across all his albums. He's not giving himself a pass, and there's a lot of messy truth in the line like, "I found peace in drowning," especially when there's an implication of jealousy and the possibility of cheating crops up with his ex going back to somebody else, and the old murderous impulses, they're gonna rear their heads. I mean, the extended metaphors of magic wands, guns, and boys linked together, it might just feel like a dick joke, but it's sold just seriously enough to make some good symbolic tissue, and it works for the midsection. But it's also one reason why him taking control of the situation and just ending the relationship has real dramatic power on A Boy's a Gun, as he tries to cut through all the jealous bullshit in his own mind. It's a striking, borderline triumphant moment, but dealing with genuine affection beneath it's never that simple, as the cleanness of Puppet and the reflexive arrogant deflection of what's good with all his machismo, but it will then prove. A song that ends with the line, I don't know what's harder, letting go or just being okay with it. And then you would think that Gone Gone Thank You would be the moment of maturity to realize that he's learned something and show some real self-awareness surrounding what his ex did and what he did and then all of his emotions about all of it, only for the second half of the song after the beat switch for him to proclaim that he'll never love again. And yeah, it's a backslide, but it is a realistic one that makes sense as a guy who's trying to convince himself that he's really not that hurt and he's looking forward. There is that element of toxic masculinity there that even Tyler will admit. But then he ends the album with a desperate plea for friendship, ditching all the jealousy and what might be the most emotionally raw and honest moment on the entire album. And yeah, it actually feels earned. It probably saves the album for as a whole thematically for me from all the frustrations and the projection and the self-destructive toxicity. But it doesn't feel like a moment set up to change or grow Tyler, that he's learned something, which is where all that dramatic juxtaposition, all the voices around him can dampen that emotional connection I have to him, flaws and all. Again, there's so much artifice it deflects me from him. And you know what's funny? Going into Flower Boy 2 years back, when he made it pretty clearly about his sexuality with his warmth and his sensitivity that rocked the hip-hop world, I remember a lot of the detractors who highlighted how much Tyler's a troll who toyed with a lot of expectations, and I never bought it. Tyler might lean on abstraction and deflection and provocation, but between the lines there was a lot more revealing moments than he would dare admit, and Flower Boy was the first point where he could stand in the sunlight effectively, push all that subtext into the text, and it worked beautifully. Now on Igor, the text and thematic arc, it makes sense on an emotional and narrative level, and the jealousy, the failed coping mechanisms, the backsliding, it works as he tries to process the breakup and move on effectively. But I don't know, they also feel like moments bereft of the revelatory snapshots and human growth and vulnerability that Flower Boy showed that Tyler was capable of. And maybe cracking that sort of routine and emotional barrier might need to be chipped away before it's actually shattered, and this album's the chip. Then again, Tyler references being told that he's on the spectrum, which I could absolutely believe, and it's hard not to believe him at his word and accept for him how he might just be that blunt. That's what it is for him in his mind. Find him relatable in the broad, forethought but clumsy emotional moves, and just be kind of underwhelmed and frustrated by the music around him that deflects from that approach's raw power. And you know what? That's where I think I am with Igor. I'm giving it a strong 6 out of 10 and a recommendation for the fans following his emotional arc, but it's not quite as striking or original or really beautiful as Flower Boy was. Not as emotionally gripping for me. I just kind of feel a little distant from it. It's potent stuff and definitely good. Again, I totally see why so many people have gotten sucked into it. I just wish that I found it great. That's all. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I know I'm going to get so much backlash for this review, but again, it is good. I like the tones. I like some of the grooves. I just wish that I could connect with it a little bit more strongly. It's just not clicking as deeply as I'd like to, and I think all the artifice around it is not helping him. It would be interesting if Tyler did an unplugged show or something that's a little bit more intimate. I'd be curious what he would sound like with all those layers stripped away. I think we'd probably like it a lot. Especially in this state of mind, because he does have the emotional maturity and insight to lead to this place, and the emotional sight that he puts on display is really effective. But hey, if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I am curious for all you to tell me how wrong I am. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to help support the channel, link to my Patreon's also over there. And just a friendly note, if you're looking for a Billboard breakdown, it's on a new channel. Keep saying it all the time. Link's also in the card over here. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.